excited to take a fresh look at retail media's impact on shopper attitudes and behavior with you. So first up, I would love to introduce our amazing speakers. Huge thank you to Bryan Gildenberg, CEO of Confluencer Commerce and co-host of the CPG Guys podcast. Hi, Bryan.
Hey there, everybody. How you doing?
Wonderful. Bryan's been a trusted advisor on commerce for 25 years now and has held senior leadership roles at Kantar and Omnicom's retail marketing agencies. Bryan, so glad to have you with us. And we also have Gareth Johns. Gareth is Chief Data Officer here at TruRating, and he's been using data for over 25 years now to help businesses become customer-centric. Hi, Gareth.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here.
Awesome. And yeah, fun fact, Gareth actually started his career at dunnhumby in the UK with Tesco before helping launch dunnhumby USA, which is now 8451 at Kroger. So excited to have all of your industry expertise today. So without further ado, let's talk about what we have in store for you today. So those on this call will be the first to hear about the data that we've sourced from over 130,000 shoppers straight from the shopping aisles. So today we are going to cover some amazing topics: how consumers are feeling about retail advertising, the impact that it has on actual buying decisions, which ad channels are more or less desirable by demographic and vertical, and then we'll wrap with one of my favorite topics, which is just a really clear picture of how you can implement attribution and really quantify recall and ad impact in your stores. All right. So Bryan, I mean, you talk about this stuff day in, day out. You have relationships with hundreds of retailers and CPGs. You've seen retail media evolve from print and radio to digital. I'd really like to start off with just your general perspective on the current state of retail advertising. What are you hearing?
Well, fortunately, I just left the advertising week or ad week conference in New York to come to this undisclosed location to conduct this webinar. So I think there's a couple of things that are, I think, incredibly important as we look at this. Number one, clearly retail media is having a moment and it has arrived, and that moment will, almost certainly continue for the foreseeable future. I think if you look at retail media within the broader context of media, and that's where we'll start, I think you've got to look at it with three factors that are shifting the media landscape significantly in favor of retail media. Number one is, for those of you that had degradation of cookies in your buzzword bingo section, at 11:03 we got there. So that's an important thing from a media perspective, but obviously the deterioration of what historically used to be personally identifiable and traceable marketing in the digital world has some implications for retail media ecosystems, particularly retail media ecosystems that have sort of self-contained first-party data that's validatable and useful that can be used in the media world. So I think that's one phase. I think the second factor is the continued decline and fall of linear television as a marketing tool. And third, which I think is going to get interesting, is the disruption that's happening in search. And the disruption in search, everybody thinks about ChatGPT when you talk about search disruption, but what you're really seeing today is disruption that's being caused mostly not by search at all, or ChatGPT at all, by TikTok and by other platforms, and consumers are reaching and understanding and identifying things in new ways. All of this means that the ability to see the purchase journey more clearly, more comprehensively, and to see where it ends, i.e. in a purchase, becomes incredibly important. And the second big component, so that's all the changes in the digital media world, and that's a lot of the conversation that we're having this week at Ad Week. I think secondarily, God bless Andrew Lipsman and Insider Intelligence for putting together a chart that showed something fairly obvious, which is that way more people going to a Walmart store than going to Walmart's web. Charts become sort of a staple, if you will, of the retail media ecosystem. And that today people are really beginning to realize that the store is going to be a major part of the media landscape, not just a website. And so now you've got all the things forcing people to look at retail that we just talked about, and people starting to wake up and realize, oh, geez, 88% of Walmart's business goes through a store. We should care about that. And the math on that's unrelenting, obvious, but no less significant for it being obvious. And so today, I think that what you're seeing is an increased intensity and focus on being able to put media assets in the store, one, and we'll talk about that, but and then two, what are the assets that are already there, right? Like there's a ton of quote unquote lower funnel activation based media, i.e. stuff in a store today that already exists, that's already planned, that already has a commercial engine attached to it. And that increasingly the work, and this is the last thing I'll say before I shut up for a minute, is that the work for brands and retailers is to try to bring together the historic sides of your organization that have thought about media in a certain way with the people that have historically thought about commerce in a certain way. And trying to get those two people to even have a conversation where they understand each other is going to be work in and of itself. Never mind getting to a point where I can plan. The critical piece of all of that, of course, is the ability to actually assess what's happening in store and measure it appropriately. And I think that's where, and the thing you realize very quickly, and Gareth, you and I will chat about this as we go through, is that I've always thought of trying to measure in-store behavior as like the quantum physics of marketing, right? It's incredible. It's like an incredibly small compressed space where all the rules are really different than they used to be. And you can't just assume that what I know about marketing in the big world is going to work when I do it in the store. I actually have to understand the store. And in order to do that, I have to understand the store as close to the moment that the person's in it as I can. You know, at Kantar, we did shopper research for years. And the thing we discovered is if you ask somebody 20 minutes after they've been in the store what they did while they were there, they're going to give you a terrible answer. What you really have to do is capture them as close to the moment. And oftentimes you do that by like shopping next to them, which isn't creepy or weird at all. Or increasingly today, you've got all sorts of in-store measurement tools that are available to be able to do that. And I think the importance of actually being able to understand someone's journey through the store and what they think of it at the end is just going to be particularly compelling. So that's sort of the overview. So I hope that's helpful to everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bryan. Yeah, I appreciate you setting the stage for us and really talking about, how important it is to capture feedback in the moment, which is one of the ways that we captured feedback for this particular study that we're about to get into. So I know we're going to get into some really interesting data points to take our conversation another layer deeper. But before we do, Gareth, can you just really quickly touch on how you got your hands on such recent and representative data that we're about to cover?
So at TruRating, we ask each customer a single question, and it's on the pin pad. So as Bryan was talking about, it's as close to that moment of shopping as we can get. It's directly before payment. And we work with several retailers in different sectors and different geographies. And while the vast majority of the questions that we ask in store are for the purpose of helping that individual retailer to improve the shopping experience for their own customers, we do occasionally use the opportunity to ask questions which can provide some new data on, I guess, more of a general state of retail, about how customers are feeling about retail and about their shopping experience. So we hear from about 3 million customers a week. So even when we utilize just 1 or 2% of those question slots in any 1 week, it doesn't take us long to gain some pretty interesting insight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gareth. All right, so let's get into it. We know retail media has a profound influence on shoppers, but what else can you tell us about how advertising actually shapes shopper decision-making and choices?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues for both retailers and brands in the area of retail media, and especially in-store retail media, is how to make sure that that kind of overall set of retail media isn't impacting the shopping experience in a way that's either intrusive or sort of overwhelming for the customer. So there's no point for a retailer kind of maximizing their advertising income from their media estate if it comes at the expense of customers' shopping experiences, such that they either end up making less visits or putting fewer items in their basket. And to Bryan's point just a minute ago about getting these two teams to talk to each other, that's requiring people who are kind of focused on selling media with people who are focused on, I guess, growing customer loyalty. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And at the moment, retail media is generally, I feel, measured kind of in isolation. It's how successful was this particular campaign, and there's no sort of measure on the overall impact of the in-store environment and kind of what impact that's having on customer experience. So that was really one of the first things that we looked at. And yeah, what that led us to was this first finding, which is from the research that we've done, at least 68% of the customers surveyed, so that's across retailers in grocery, footwear and apparel, department stores, discounters, convenience, they said that they found advertising in store to be useful. So that's a pretty good first kind of headline, I guess. And so as more and more retailers start to leverage the store as a media channel, and I think as there are more and more ways in which we deliver media in store, what's going to be interesting is whether that 68% goes up or kind of starts to drop off, and whether customers continue to find utility in all the media within store. And yeah, and whether that balance starts to dip and kind of suffer in the wrong way. And then I think another interesting point from the research is that overall 43% of customers said they weren't actively looking for promotions in store before deciding what to buy. Now, obviously not all in-store media is going to be delivered in the form of promotions, but I think if you think of it from a customer point of view, they're mainly thinking about and interpreting a promotion sort of by and large as you know, a deal or money off. But the point is that customers are open to messaging in store and they're ready to be influenced in their purchasing decisions. And that 43% is also not sort of consistent across retailers or sectors. So we obviously asked the questions in lots of different retailers, and we saw that a retailer that caters predominantly kind of to the tween or teen audience, purchasing items that are already pretty cheap, they are much less important for them. So promotions for them only accounted for kind of 15% of customers deciding on what to buy. Whereas in grocery, that kind of grows to more like 47% of customers saying they look for promotions before deciding what to put in their cart. And then I guess at the far end of the scale, one of our retailers is pretty price savvy, seniors mainly looking for clothing and household goods. And there you have almost 70% of customers looking for what's on promotion and what promotions are available and what media is out there before deciding what to make, what purchases to make. So I think overall what we're seeing is that customers are receptive to advertising. Whether it lands well or not is obviously a question of how relevant the message is to the customer, and that will grow the chances of success. But I think as Bryan stated when we were kind of discussing this earlier in the week, you've at least got an invite to the wedding, which I thought was a really good take on yeah, where advertising fits for customers in the store.
Yeah, Bryan, what's your take on this? Do these stats surprise you at all?
I think yeah, in addition to the point where that 68%, I think is what I would call the prima facie case for in-store media, right? Like this is the, I'm open, like don't screw it up, but I'm open, right? So so I also think the interesting thing is than I would have anticipated. In terms of the shopper even having the vague understanding that there's something to retail media that isn't an in-store promotion is actually interesting in and of itself. And that secondarily, the gap is that big because that 25%, if you looked at it within the context of the 43, it's basically, 60% of the shopper, but you got over 35% of the delivered at large. I think it's extremely encouraging for anybody that's trying to do something beyond price and promotion in an in-store environment, because it's not, that's the other invitation is here. It's like, look, I got a big chunk of shoppers that are like, look, I think in-store media can be useful, but I don't look for promotions. That 25%, I think, is a really interesting number.
Thanks, Bryan. So let's take that overall impact on retail media that you described, and maybe we can break it down a little bit further. Gareth, can you talk us through what we're actually seeing in the data when we break it down by media channel and by segment?
Yeah, so one of the questions we asked, I guess, if you think of retail media, it's often used as a way to advertise or educate customers on new product launches. And so we asked this question kind of specific to this point, which was, what types of media have in the past driven a customer to go on and try a new product? And really, we're comparing to see where in-store media places against other channels for that kind of job of educating and nudging customers into a new type of purchase. So most of the questions we asked in this area were kind of along the lines of, have you ever tried a new product because of, like, questions? And then we sort of substituted in different types of media. And what we found was that for the first, I guess, type of retail media that we looked at, we saw that 28% of customers have tried a new product because of an in-store video. Now, this may increase over time as in-store video displays become more widespread, but whether the majority of customers are primed and ready to watch, I think, is yet to be determined. Video obviously has many benefits in terms of the ability to deploy to stores, the ability to change throughout the day, also to evolve over time to make use of things like augmented reality. But at least at the middle to kind of latter part of 2023, when we did the surveys, I think the best you could say is that there's a lot of untapped potential in that sort of channel at the moment. As we move on, we have more customers say that they would or have been influenced by an online advert. And at least at an overall level across all customer types, it's pretty similar to the performance we see when using an online influencer. You can see they're pretty close. We'll come back to that later in the presentation because that does differ for different customer groups. And then the next one would be, we looked at, I guess, a traditional media channel of coupons. And there we see that 37% of customers are saying that they have been influenced to try a new product by coupons. So that as a type of media that exists, that encourages customers, is pretty impressive. But it's beaten just a bit by trying free samples. So as you're moving into store and the types of, I guess, media and promotions that you can do in store, free samples as a way of getting customers to purchase is growing. But what was most interesting to me, and I guess the bigger reveal at the end, was that 47% of customers have been influenced to try a new product because of an in-store display. So if we look at a type of retail media, that kind of in-store display, gondola end type occasion, at the very least from a historical perspective, in-store media looks to be one of the most effective channels for raising awareness and driving trade. And that as stores implement these new technologies, these video screens, augmented reality, whatever it might be, I think what you could say at the moment is that there's a lot of untapped potential to make even more engaged customer experiences in store. And then if we just break that 47% down, I think what's interesting as well is to look at how that differs by different categories. And what you can see there is that in-store displays don't work evenly across sectors. And there's an in-store display can have a big impact in fashion and footwear, we see there, sort of 68%. It's influencing new purchases in just over half of grocery customers. But at least from our data, convenience retail kind of sticks out as seems to be an area where it looks harder to sway customers into experimenting and trying something new.
Awesome. Thank you, Gareth. And Bryan, I know the last time we spoke, you talked about how much money is actually poured into display in the C-store. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts now that you're kind of seeing these stats relative to one another?
Well, if you go back to the last stats, I mean, just that one slide, I think was on the last one was eye-opening enough to, and you didn't have to do that. I meant more metaphorically, but this will work too. So I mean, if you just put this chart up and the bars are all the same size and you have numbers on them, you ask the average CMO to guess these numbers, the degree to which they would be wrong would be astonishing. So just in terms, and if you think about more specifically, where are your resources deployed to getting consumers to try something new? And where's your headspace deployed? You would find that increasingly a lot of the resources and headspace are aimed at things like influencers and online, and really missing some of the basic mechanics that are historically the work of customer teams and commercial teams around making sure that the in-store display work and all that and all these other pieces. But the fact that an in-store display is 30% or more effective than an influencer in terms of driving new behavior, that in and of itself is worth the cost of admission for this webinar. So which is of course nothing. But now if you go to the next slide, back to that. Yeah, and I think this is now a really interesting insight for commercial teams, right? Because if you look at this today, and it's the amount of time and money deployed by convenience-centric brands and categories to buy C-store space to encourage trial is enormous, right? So if all of a sudden I realize that in real life, what the purposes of a display and convenience store may not be to get somebody to try something new, but maybe to get them to find the thing they came to look for more quickly, because that's the mode the shopper's actually in. Because they're trying to get back into their car before the gas pump fills up so they can get on their way. That this is not a browsing environment as much as it is a conversion environment. And if I thought about, okay, well, maybe my end aisle displays aren't for my new products there, but maybe they're for something else, or maybe I can de-emphasize my end aisle displays because I'm using them to do something where they don't make any sense. So I think just these observations, and again, this is the quantum mechanics of marketing, right? When you started doing quantum mechanics for the first time, and you found out that white was a wave and a particle, it confused everybody because nobody really knew what that meant. Today, you're learning things when you study this granular behavior that are often counterintuitive and really surprising. And having done a lot of in-store research in my life, you find this stuff all the time. But the ability to capture it real time, like we're doing here, is really important. I think the other thing that's critical here that is going to become a bigger and bigger part of this world, which are that we're all going to be looking for measurement in store. And the minute we start to measure, we're going to be looking for norms. Norms are an incredibly important part of any measurement ecosystem. Of course, in this world, the variance in performance of media asset is so dramatic by channel or type of retail that we've got to be very careful about industry average norms, where you're going to end up with basically one foot in an oven, 1 foot in an ice bucket, and statistically speaking, we're fine. We really need to understand whether we're in the oven or the ice bucket when we're doing stuff, and the norms that are going to be most appropriate, I believe, are probably the norms that are derived at a format or a channel level, not at an overall industry level. And I think this slide is just a terrific revelation of that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bryan. And speaking of being intuitive and creative, I want to jump just really quickly to everyone's favorite enigma right now, I think, which are our amazing Gen Zs. Gareth, talk us through just what you saw when you compared the impact of various advertising channels specifically for this unique demographic.
It's hard for me to talk about this generation without coming across as like old-fashioned dad, but I'm going to do my best. So, yeah. The questions that we ask in lots of different stores. So what that enables us to do is in stores that predominantly target this generation, when we look at the responses in those stores versus stores that are maybe more mainstream or target an older generation, we can get a sense of kind of what the Gen Z population are telling us. And as digital natives that, they don't go anywhere without a phone in their hand, it's not surprising to see that retailers are using digital channels to try and influence this group. And if you remember when we looked back a couple of slides ago at customers as a whole, online ads and online influencers came out about even in their ability to reach customers. For Gen Z, which I guess focus much more on authenticity, and as you might expect for this group, online influencers hold more sway. What was interesting to coming out of the research was that we could quantify how much by more. And what we see there is that for this cohort, at least, an online influencer is 1.8 times more important to them in terms of influencing their purchasing decisions than an online ad. So, I guess at that level, you might think that that's kind of, it's interesting, but it's also sort of obvious, and it's what you would expect. I think what was maybe more surprising was when we asked this cohort again, whether they tried a new product because of an in-store display. And what we saw there was actually that in-store displays were much more effective for them than even an online influencer in kind of changing their behavior. So as much as we say that this group is digitally native, I think they're still looking for, and they are still very much open to inspiration when they come into the store, the physical store. So there's still a big opportunity to reach this group through some of these more kind of traditional methods.
Thanks, Gareth. And Bryan, I know you're the father of 15-year-olds, and we've all watched retail media evolve significantly over the last couple of decades. Talk to me about what you're hearing about Gen Z, and does that line up with the kiddos in your household?
Well, yeah, I think, my daughter will spend money in any way possible. So she's an omni-channel loss-making operation. So So, there's that meme that goes around on Instagram all the time. It's like having a daughter is like having an adorable broke best friend who thinks you're rich. So that's our. So yeah, I think, but yeah, I think in general, look, again, I think that this data just, I think underscores the biggest thing about stores, which is that, when you're just talking about the straight up velocity you can deliver through the store is just like, it's orders of magnitude sometimes larger than what you can accomplish in the digital ecosystem. And just, it's easy to forget that. And it's easy for people that grew up trained in performance marketing and trained in the digital world to just lose sight of the basic on the ground physical reality that slides like this kind of reveal. I also think secondarily that, Gen Z appears to respond well to the same types of things that other humans have responded well to since the advent of modern retail. So which is not terribly surprising in that my children are at the very least recognizably human. Most days, and that in general, yeah, I think that. But again, if you think about the amount of headspace, not money, because in-store displays cost a lot, but I think about the amount of headspace that goes into thinking about what my online influence campaign is going to look like. And I think about how much strategic airtime my online influence marketers and agencies get at the CMO level versus how much mind share airtime do my in-store display agencies and people responsible for that get at a senior management level. I think if somebody sat down with the CMO and said, look, you're 50% more likely to do something off of this than this. Could you please devote a little bit more headspace to it? I think that would be a pretty rational request. But I think right now, I think there's just a notion that because the online stuff is sexier and more interesting, that it gets more airtime. But you're just looking at basic data here that again just reveals just how powerful the store as a platform can and should be.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bryan. Yeah, many of these stats I think surprised us too, but the validity here is clear. These are 100,000 in the moment shoppers and data that's just a few weeks old or even a few weeks fresh, I should probably say. So super incredibly recent. And just to kind of circle back to your point earlier, as we looked at norms across channels, we looked at them across demographics and sectors, and we still know that every retailer, every brand, every product is its own unique snowflake. And this methodology for tapping into perception and recall is extremely unique. So Gareth, I want to wrap with you maybe sharing with us kind of the importance of, and maybe some steps that retailers can take to better understand their unique situation and some best practices that they can take.
So far, we're really only starting to kind of tap into what we believe will be a really interesting and rich picture of how in-store media is driving product awareness, recall, and changing customer behavior, and really helping add another dimension to the ways in which retail media is already being measured. So while most of the questions we've asked in the rotation so far have just been questions that any one customer gets at random, as hopefully you've just seen from the demo going while I've been talking, we now have the ability to wait to see what's in a customer's basket before deciding which question to ask. And that really unlocks another level of richness to the data, in that for an individual retailer or brand, we could move beyond some of these kind of high level insights we've discussed today and get right down into, how did a particular media campaign work? What did customers feel about it? How did it impact their behavior? And how has it changed their perceptions? And I think that adds a really interesting dimension to the ways in which retail media is already being measured. So it's not to say that, this comes in place of what's already out there, but I think as you look at the ways to measure retail media and you think about the idea of not just looking for, what's the sales uplift, but what's the impact on customer? How does it change their perceptions? How much of them do they recall those products? I think that being able to ask questions about specific campaigns from people who have either purchased that product that's on advert or promotion and people that haven't will be an interesting way to kind of really help drive what works best in this area.
Thanks so much, Gareth. So, all right, I think now is a perfect time to open up for questions. If you guys have questions, please type them into the chat. We will send a recording to everybody that attended and provided their email address after the webinar. And if we don't get to your question today, we will absolutely reach out directly, or feel free to reach out to us. So as you guys are typing those in, just wanted to share that all three of us are searchable on LinkedIn, and we'd be more than happy to have one-on-one chats just to keep the discussion going. So with that being said, let's hit off a few questions. First, we have, all right, guys, what do you think are the challenges for in-store retail media in the future? Bryan, you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges are, I think simple, and some are simple and obvious, which are that, one, the space that retail media in store comes to life in is historically planned, measured, executed, and owned by a completely different set of people and people buy media from them. And that their definition of success is different. Their timing and frame of planning is different. So often the media ecosystem tries to be real-time responsive. This is very difficult to do in a physical store. The physical store environment is one of the longest cycle planning things a large brand does, or any brand does in the world. Apart from maybe R&D, it's the longest cycle thing that they actually, the longest cycle demand creation exercise in any business is the Walmart planning. Right? Because you got to get that thing nailed basically finger tight over a year ahead of when it gets executed, which is just not the way media teams think about things. So I would say that there's a basic vocabulary issue around the people that plan this stuff. I think there's a timing point. I also think that just in general, there's going to be a lot of, I think, open questions around, if I'm going to dedicate space in the physical store to something, do I want to dedicate it to something that is media centric? Or do I need to dedicate it to something that's conversion centric? Or do I think about the problem in an integrated way? So I really think that most of the challenge with retail media today isn't at all with the retail side of it, or even in particular with the media side. It's about how those two words have to come together. And the way in which those two ecosystems, the retail ecosystem and the media ecosystem, have been managed both by retailers and by brands, is that those two ecosystems have been managed by two people that right now, if you put them in a room and ask them to solve a problem, would really struggle to even basically understand one another in terms of how they look at solving the problem. So I think a lot of the barriers are that old classic cartoon strip of "we have met the enemy and he is us," and I think that's a lot of this. I don't know that there's this data reveals there's no conceptual problem with trying to run media in the store, and there's no real shopper acceptance problem. The problem is being able to build something that makes sense. And I think a lot of the barriers to that are largely internal within inside the companies that are trying to do it.
Nice. Thank you, Bryan. Couple more questions. So Gareth, the in-store research capabilities you described are really interesting. From your perspective, how can retail media teams and CPG companies and commerce teams really all use this data to partner and work together?
Well, I think we can obviously run questions that are very specific to an individual campaign, and I think over time we will build up a best practice kind of bank of what works well and what doesn't work well in certain situations. I think for retailers as well, the ability to almost check how all of their retail media together is influencing customers is going to become really important, because kind of to Bryan's point just now, we talk about these things very much in isolation, and I think we talk about them campaign by campaign. And in all of this, what's being lost is the customer. So the customer's not really coming into the conversation enough. And so I think from a retail point of view, there is a best practice, which is kind of, the brand wins, the retailer wins, the customer wins. And trying to think about how those three work together will be important. And we can obviously look at a combination of questions that we can ask about a particular campaign and its awareness and recall, questions about how a customer experienced the store as a whole and how that's changing over time as retail media becomes a bigger, a better, a newer, brighter thing. And then kind of, how a brand's doing as well with some of the metrics that they will already be expecting to measure kind of effectiveness on in terms of sales uplift. So I think it's going to be a combination of things that retailers, brands are going to have to look at to really understand what works well for the customer.
Thank you, Gareth. And we will wrap with one final question. Bryan, I think you're probably best to take this. So we talked a lot about, integrating the retail media experience just into the shopping experience. So one of our attendees is asking, what are some tips or some things that retailers can do to take advantage of retail media while still maintaining and creating those really great experiences and not overburdening the customers?
Well, I think, I think it's a great question, because I think if you look at the history of any platform that has started to take advertising, the only thing that is consistently true across all of them is that eventually people put too many ads on. So I mean, that is the inexorable law of advertising. So I mean, the entire reason, subscription-based cable television exists is because network television in the late 1970s broke the viewer experience by putting too many ads on it. And things like home box office cropped up in the late 70s and early 80s as a solution to give people an ad-free experience in television. So it's the advantage of being old. You can see a lot of this stuff. That has consistently happened with every platform that has ever sold advertising, including, by the way, the physical store, which goes through phases of this all the time, where whether it was Walmart emphasizing everyday low price instead of overburdening the consumer with coupons, or whether it was Target putting together a cleaner shopping environment to avoid overburdening the consumer with in-store display activity like Walmart was doing, or whether that is whatever, every time a new media platform comes along, there's too much advertising. When somebody comes along with a proposition, they try to monetize differently, but reduce the ad burden to the shopper. I think today, right now, sure, there's a risk of doing that in store. There's a risk of doing that everywhere. Amazon's cluttering its experience with the way it does this in its digital ecosystem in a way that's making Amazon increasingly difficult to shop. Google's the king of this. I mean, from a search results point of view, trying to find your actual answer on Google today has become way harder than it was 5 years ago, because of the ad burden that the shopper has to go through, the inquirer has to go through to get to the actual algorithmically derived answer. So yes, I think that unquestionably, if we're doing this webinar 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about how there's too much advertising in the store and how do we declutter it and get back to the shopping experience. And that's the only thing I can say with 100% certainty. That being said, how do you do it? Well, you just have to, it's very category and situation dependent. And that's the problem that I think in particular media teams struggle with. They struggle with any problem where the answer isn't templatable, programmatically viable, and spreadsheetable. And I don't think this problem lends itself particularly well to that. I think this problem lends itself well to granularity of understanding around specific behavior, specific moments, and meeting the shopper when they are. The last piece that I'll say is that so often media is about trying to reach who you are, demographically, psychographically, whatever it is, right? That's how I target based on who you are. Retail media is almost inevitably going to be more about not person, but context. Where you are, why you are, what you're doing, when you're there. Way more important in the retail media ecosystem than who you are. If I'm walking through a convenience store and I'm in the middle of a 200-mile drive and I'm thirsty and I need some basic, things out of the shopping trip, I'm more similar to my 15-year-old son at that point than I am to somebody who's demographically identical to me. Our need states are the same. The ability to understand that, decode it, and then structure communications around it, I think will be the key to winning.
Thank you so much, Bryan. And what an incredible way to kind of sum everything up with that last question and wrap. We will again send out the recording to everybody that registered. We are so grateful to everybody that attended. Bryan, Gareth, thank you so much for all of your amazing insights and for taking time out of your busy day to join our webinar. And myself personally, I need to get back to work because I have 2 little girls who will one day also be teenagers who want to spend mom and dad's money like you described, Bryan. Back to work we all go to make sure that we can afford the lifestyle that our youngins
just take like a little portable vacuum cleaner, put it on your wallet for a while. It'll get you, it's good practice. So
love that. Thank you for the advice. All right. And thank you again, everybody, for joining, and we'll see you next time.